The city was drowning in winter's bitter grasp. The streets lined with dirty ice-packed snow that refused to melt. The wind howled between towering skyscrapers, cutting through the thickest of coats like invisible blades. Cars whooshed by, their tires splashing slush onto the sidewalks, where people rushed past, their heads down, too focused on their own lives to notice the woman curled up in the shadow of a closed bakery. Samantha Reed sat with her back pressed against the brick wall, her legs drawn up to her chest. Her tattered coat, 2 sizes too big, did little to shield her from the freezing night. Strands of unkempt blonde hair peeked out from under an old beanie, framing a face that once held promise. High cheekbones, full lips, and sharp brown eyes that once brimmed with determination. Now they were hollow, tired, and wary of the world. Her fingers, wrapped in fingerless gloves, trembled as she rubbed them together for warmth. The city didn't care about people like her. It kept moving, its dazzling lights mocking those who had fallen through the cracks. But one man noticed. Alexander Cole stepped out of his sleek black Bentley, his polished leather shoes crunching against the ice-coated pavement. Dressed in a tailored black wool coat over an expensive charcoal suit, he was the picture of wealth and precision. Every detail, from the cufflinks on his wrists to the neatly styled dark brown hair, screamed success. He didn't normally take this route home. Tonight, he had attended a gala, one of those tedious charity events where billionaires patted themselves on the back for writing checks they'd barely notice missing. He had donated millions that evening, funds that would supposedly go toward homeless relief efforts. But standing there, staring at the woman huddled in the freezing cold, he wondered if any of it actually made a difference. Something about her stopped him in his tracks. Maybe it was the way her shoulders trembled violently in the cold. Maybe it was the way she stared at the ground as if she had already accepted her fate. Or maybe it was something else entirely. Something tugging at a buried memory he couldn't quite grasp. Without thinking, Alexander moved toward her. Samantha noticed his expensive shoes first, stopping inches from where she sat. Then, a deep, smooth voice cut through the night air. "Are you okay?" She stiffened, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her coat. She had heard that question before, from passers-by who never stopped long enough to actually help, from people who stared at her with pity before vanishing into their warm apartments. "I'm fine," she muttered. It was a lie. They both knew it. Alexander crouched down, bringing himself to her eye level. Up close, he saw the exhaustion in her face, the way her skin was raw from the cold. Her eyes, though dulled by hardship, held an intelligence he didn't expect. "You don't look fine," he said, his voice quieter now. "Do you have anywhere to go?" Samantha's lips pressed into a thin line. "Why do you care?" It wasn't an accusation. It was genuine confusion. He didn't have an answer. People like him weren't supposed to stop for people like her. But he had, and now he couldn't walk away. "Come with me," he said. She scoffed. "Yeah, right. Not going to some shelter." "I'm not taking you to a shelter," he said firmly. "I have a penthouse nearby. You can warm up, get something to eat." Samantha's stomach twisted at the mention of food. She hadn't eaten a proper meal in 2 days, but suspicion lingered. Why would a man in a designer coat who smelled like expensive cologne and success care about a homeless woman? "You some kind of creep?" she asked, her voice laced with bitterness. Alexander smirked, the first hint of amusement breaking through his otherwise serious expression. "If I were, I doubt I'd be offering you a warm bed and a meal." She eyed him carefully. There was something about him, something steady, something safe. The wind howled again, sinking its icy claws into her skin. Samantha let out a shaky breath. "Just for the night," Alexander nodded. Just for the night. But neither of them knew how much that one decision would change both of their lives. Samantha had never been inside a place like this before. As Alexander led her through the front door, the contrast between where she had been just minutes ago and where she stood now was almost too much to process. The warmth of the penthouse hit her first. making her shiver as the cold melted off her skin. The air smelled of cedarwood and something faintly citrusy, probably some ridiculously expensive air freshener. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering city skyline, stretching so far and high it made her dizzy. The penthouse was sleek, modern, and almost clinical in its perfection. Marble floors reflected the soft glow of ambient lighting, and expensive leather furniture sat artfully arranged as if no one had ever actually used it. Everything about the place screamed wealth, and yet somehow it felt empty. Alexander shrugged off his coat, tossing it onto a chair with practiced carelessness before turning to look at her. "Bathrooms down the hall. There are clean towels. You can shower. Warm up," he said. "I'll find you something dry to wear." Samantha didn't move. She still wasn't sure if this was real. She was inside a billionaire's penthouse, in a warm space, not on the streets, not huddled on a frozen bench. Her mind screamed that she didn't belong here. "I don't understand," she said quietly, her voice hoarse from disuse. "Why are you doing this?" Alexander studied her for a moment, his sharp blue eyes unreadable. "I don't either," he admitted. That should have alarmed her, but strangely, it didn't. After a long silence, Samantha nodded and slowly made her way down the hall. The bathroom was bigger than some apartments she'd lived in before. Marble countertops, a massive glass shower, gold fixtures. It was the kind of place designed for people who never had to worry about basic needs. She caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. Her cheeks were hollow, her lips cracked, her eyes sunken from exhaustion. She looked lost. Samantha turned away and stepped into the shower. The hot water was almost painful against her frozen skin, but she forced herself to stay under the stream, letting the warmth soak into her bones. For the first time in years, she felt human again. When she emerged, she found a neatly folded pile of clothes waiting outside the bathroom door. A simple black t-shirt, gray sweatpants, and socks. Nothing fancy, but clean and warm. She slipped into them, savoring the softness against her skin. Tentatively, she made her way back to the main living area. Alexander was in the kitchen, sleeves rolled up, moving with ease as he prepared something on the stove. The sight of a billionaire cooking was almost laughable, but the scent of garlic and tomatoes filled the air, making her stomach twist with hunger. "I don't usually cook," he said without looking up, "but I figured a real meal would be better than takeout." Samantha hesitated. "I can leave after I eat." "You don't have to." He plated a steaming bowl of pasta and set it in front of her at the kitchen island. "Sit." She obeyed, her hunger outweighing her pride. The first bite was heaven. She closed her eyes, savoring the warmth that spread through her. Alexander leaned against the counter, watching her. "When was the last time you had a home-cooked meal?" She swallowed hard. "I don't remember." He didn't press further. For a few minutes they sat in silence, her eating, him nursing a glass of whiskey. The quiet was comfortable, but Alexander's mind was racing. He knew there was more to her story. Homelessness didn't just happen overnight, not to someone like her. She was young, smart, once full of ambition. He remembered her name now, Samantha Reed. She had won the Cole Enterprises Journalism Scholarship 6 years ago. That scholarship had been awarded to the brightest minds in the country. So why was she on the streets? "You won my company's scholarship," he said finally. Samantha froze, her fork hovering midair. "I did," she admitted after a long pause. "A lifetime ago." Alexander's expression hardened. "What happened?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Life happened." When he didn't look away, she sighed, setting her fork down. "I was supposed to make something of myself. I got into one of the top journalism schools, worked harder than I ever had in my life. I had dreams, plans." Her voice wavered. "And then, my mom got sick." Alexander remained silent, letting her speak. "She had cancer," Samantha continued. "Stage 4 by the time they caught it. I dropped out to take care of her. Worked 2 jobs, tried to afford her treatment, but nothing worked. She died 2 years later." She stared at the marble countertop as if willing herself not to break. I lost everything after that. The apartment, the savings, the stability. I tried to go back to school, but I was drowning in debt. The bills, the loans, it was too much. I ended up couch surfing for a while, thinking I'd get back on my feet. Alexander's grip on his glass tightened. But life isn't that forgiving, she said with a sad smile. I lost my last job when the company downsized. Couldn't pay rent. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, I was just another person no one noticed. Alexander exhaled, setting his glass down with a quiet clink. The world had failed her. His world had failed her. The very system he was part of, one that rewarded the wealthy and discarded the struggling, had pushed her to the fringes. And she wasn't the only one. "How long?" he asked. Samantha looked up. "How long have you been homeless?" She hesitated. "A little over a year." A year. A whole year surviving in the shadows of a city that never stopped moving. Alexander's chest tightened with something he didn't quite understand. He had built an empire on logic, strategy, and calculated risks. But nothing about this made sense. How had she, a woman with so much promise, slipped through the cracks? And why did it bother him so much? Samantha looked down at her half-empty bowl. "I should go." "No." The word came out sharper than he intended. She blinked at him. "You don't have to leave," he said more gently. "Stay for now, just until you figure things out." She searched his face. "Why do you care?" Alexander didn't have an answer, but deep down, he knew this wasn't about charity. This was about redemption. And for the first time in his life, Alexander Cole wanted to fix something that money alone couldn't buy. The next morning, Alexander woke up to an unfamiliar quiet. His penthouse was always silent. No bustling family, no morning chaos, just the hum of luxury appliances and the occasional notification from his phone. But this silence was different. Something was missing. He ran a hand through his tousled dark hair and reached for his phone. It was barely past 7, but the unease crawling up his spine made him sit up. The events of the night before replayed in his mind. Samantha, cold and shivering on the street, hesitant but accepting his offer. The way her eyes had softened just a little when she had eaten. The first genuine conversation he'd had with another person in what felt like years. Swinging his legs over the side of the bed, he stood and made his way down the hall. The penthouse was eerily still. "Samantha?" he called out, but there was no answer. His gut clenched. Moving through the space, he noticed the subtle signs of her absence. The folded blanket left neatly on the couch. The empty glass of water on the kitchen counter. The borrowed clothes he had given her were gone too. She had left. A sharp sigh left his lips. He wasn't sure why he was surprised. He should have expected it. People like him didn't do things like this, and people like her didn't stick around. Still, something about it didn't sit right with him. He strode toward the penthouse door and checked the security footage on his phone. The cameras showed her leaving just before dawn, slipping out quietly as if she had never been there at all. Gone, without a note, without a goodbye, without a trace. He exhaled, his fingers tightening around the device. He should let it go. She had made her choice. Maybe she hadn't wanted his help beyond one night of warmth and food. Maybe she didn't trust him, or anyone. But something in his chest told him it wasn't that simple. Samantha Reed wasn't just another person on the street. She had been one of the most promising young minds in journalism, a scholarship recipient from his own company. And now she was a ghost, swallowed by the city. Alexander wasn't in the habit of chasing people, but this wasn't business. This was personal. Without hesitation, he grabbed his coat and headed for the door. If she thought she could disappear, she was wrong. Because for the first time in his life, Alexander Cole wasn't going to let something or someone slip through his fingers. With his vast resources, finding her wasn't difficult. He tapped into his security network, scanning street cameras near his penthouse. It didn't take long to trace her movements. She had walked nearly a mile in the freezing cold before disappearing near an old bus station on the outskirts of the city, a place forgotten by time, where rusted benches and broken vending machines bore witness to stories long abandoned. As his car pulled up to the station, the sight before him made his stomach tighten. Samantha was curled up on a wooden bench, her knees drawn to her chest, wrapped in the oversized coat he had given her. The station's flickering overhead light cast a dim, sickly glow, barely illuminating her fragile frame. She was shivering. Even in sleep, her body trembled against the bitter wind, slipping through the cracks in the walls. Her hands clutched the edges of her coat as if it were the only thing anchoring her to reality. Alexander clenched his jaw. Why the hell had she chosen this over his warm penthouse, over safety? His polished shoes echoed against the pavement as he stepped forward. She stirred at the sound, her instincts honed by survival. Her eyes fluttered open, groggy at first, but when they met his, they widened with shock. She sat up quickly, muscles tensing like a cornered animal. "What are you doing here?" she asked, voice hoarse from the cold. "I could ask you the same thing," he countered, his tone sharper than he intended. "You had a warm place to sleep, and yet you chose this?" Samantha looked away, her fingers tightening around her sleeves. "I didn't want to be a problem." Alexander let out a sharp breath. "You're not a problem, Samantha." Her lips pressed into a thin line, but she didn't answer. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Did you even have a plan? Or were you just going to keep running until you disappeared for good?" She swallowed hard, and that moment of hesitation told him everything. She had been planning to disappear, to fade into the city, one of its forgotten souls, slipping further into the cracks of society. That thought made something in his chest tighten uncomfortably. "Come back with me," he said, his voice softer now. "No strings attached. Just let me help." Samantha hesitated, staring at the cold pavement as if searching for an answer. But deep down, she already knew. She was tired. Tired of running. Tired of being invisible. And for the first time in a long time, someone had come looking for her. Slowly, she nodded. And just like that, she let herself be found. The drive back to the penthouse was silent, but not uncomfortable. Samantha sat in the passenger seat, staring out the window as the city blurred past. The streets were waking up, bathed in the pale glow of early morning. She had spent so many nights wandering these roads, searching for shelter, for warmth, for something, anything that felt like hope. Now, for the first time in years, she wasn't alone. She stole a glance at Alexander. His hands gripped the steering wheel with quiet intensity, his jaw tight, as if he were deep in thought. He hadn't demanded explanations, hadn't tried to guilt her into coming back. He had simply found her. And that was something new. When they reached the penthouse, Alexander led her inside without a word. The warmth hit her instantly, making her shiver as the last traces of the cold melted from her skin. She stood there awkwardly, unsure of what to do next. Alexander finally turned to face her, arms crossed. "First things first," he said. "You need stability. No more sleeping on bus benches." Samantha let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I suppose you're going to offer me a permanent stay in your penthouse." "Not exactly," Alexander said, his lips twitching into the ghost of a smirk. "But I am offering you an apartment, a place of your own." Her breath hitched. You don't have to do that." "I know I don't," his voice was firm, "but I want to." Samantha stared at him, waiting for the catch. Nothing in life came free. Not food, not shelter, and certainly not generosity from a billionaire. Alexander seemed to read her thoughts. "This isn't charity. Think of it as an investment." "In what?" He hesitated, then said, "You." She opened her mouth to protest, but he cut her off. "You had talent, Samantha. You still do. You were meant to be a journalist. You had the drive, the passion. Don't tell me that's gone." Her throat tightened. She had wanted that once. She had dreamed of breaking stories, exposing corruption, writing words that mattered. But life had stripped that away from her, piece by piece, until she barely recognized the person she used to be. Alexander took a step closer. "I can help you rebuild, get you back into the world, but you have to want it." Did she? Could she still dream of something more? Samantha swallowed hard, her heart pounding. The old fear clawed at her. The fear of failing again, of getting her hopes up only to watch them crumble. But when she looked into Alexander's eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Belief. Not pity, not obligation, just belief. And for the first time in years, she dared to believe, too. She took a deep breath. "Okay." A small smile touched Alexander's lips. "Good," he said. "Then let's get to work." Alexander never did anything halfway. Once he committed to something, he pursued it with the same ruthless efficiency that had built his billion-dollar empire. And now, that focus was on uncovering the truth about what had really happened to Samantha Reed. While she settled into her new apartment, a modest but comfortable space in one of his properties, he worked behind the scenes, piecing together the missing years of her life. What he found made his stomach turn. Samantha hadn't just fallen on hard times. She had been pushed by a system designed to swallow people whole and never look back. Her mother's cancer diagnosis had been the first blow, draining every dollar Samantha had saved. Then came the predatory medical bills, the impossible debt, the endless cycle of jobs that never paid enough to get ahead. But the real gut punch was what happened after. She had tried to get back into journalism. She had applied for internships, reached out to old professors, even written a few freelance pieces. But with no stable address, no permanent job history, and the weight of unpaid loans dragging her down, doors that had once been open slammed shut. Then, there was the worst part. Alexander's jaw tightened as he read the police report. 1 year ago, Samantha had taken a job as a researcher at a small investigative news site. It wasn't much, but it was a step forward, until she uncovered something she wasn't supposed to. She had been investigating a fraudulent housing scheme, one that targeted low-income renters, forcing them out of their homes through illegal evictions. The company behind it had deep pockets and powerful connections, and they had made sure she paid for asking too many questions. Samantha had been framed for theft, a fabricated accusation, a sudden termination, a black mark on her record that ensured no newsroom would ever hire her again. After that, everything unraveled. With no job, no income, and nowhere left to turn, she had ended up on the streets. Alexander set the file down, his hands clenched into fists. She had been robbed of her future, and he wasn't going to let that stand. That night, when Samantha came over for dinner, something they had started doing regularly, he sat across from her, his expression unreadable. "I found out what happened," he said quietly. Samantha froze, her fork hovering midair. "What do you mean?" "The eviction scandal, the false accusation." His voice was controlled, but there was an unmistakable edge to it. "You didn't just fall through the cracks. Someone made sure you did." Samantha paled, setting her fork down with a shaky hand. I tried to fight it, but no one listened." "I'm listening." His blue eyes locked onto hers. "And I don't let people get away with things like this." Her breath hitched. For the first time in a long time, she felt something new. Hope. Because if anyone could make things right, it was Alexander Cole. Samantha sat across from Alexander, her heart pounding in her chest. For so long, she had buried the past, convinced that there was no use fighting forces larger than herself. The system had failed her, the world had forgotten her. But now, here he was, staring at her with quiet determination, refusing to let injustice win. She swallowed. "What are you going to do?" Alexander leaned back, his fingers tapping against the polished mahogany table. "I have resources, lawyers, connections. We'll clear your name." His voice was steady, as if it were a simple business deal, but there was something else in his gaze, something personal. "And more than that, we're going to expose them." Samantha blinked. "Expose them?" A slow, calculating smile spread across his face. "You wanted to be a journalist, didn't you?" She stilled. She had dreamed of this once, of uncovering the truth, of giving a voice to those who had none. But that dream had been crushed under the weight of survival. Now Alexander was handing it back to her. "Help me build the case," he said. "Write the story. Tell the world what happened, not just to you, but to the countless others they've destroyed." 1,000 emotions crashed over her at once. Fear, doubt, hope. Could she really do this? She took a breath, her fingers tightening around the edges of the napkin in her lap. Yes, she wasn't that broken girl anymore. She wasn't the woman who had given up. She nodded. "Okay, let's do it." The next few weeks were a whirlwind. With Alexander's resources, Samantha was able to dig deeper than she ever had before. They uncovered documents, financial records, testimonies from former tenants who had been evicted under false pretenses. She met with Alexander's legal team, who worked tirelessly to erase the black mark from her record. And she wrote. For the first time in years, she let herself be a journalist again. She poured every ounce of her pain, her rage, and her determination into the words she typed. The story was raw, undeniable, backed by evidence that no one could ignore. When it was ready, Alexander used his influence to ensure it was published by one of the biggest news outlets in the country. The fallout was immediate. The corrupt executives behind the scheme were exposed, their crimes laid bare for the world to see. Investigations were launched, lawsuits filed. The company responsible for Samantha's downfall crumbled under public scrutiny. And her name, her reputation, was finally restored. She had won. But more than that, she had taken back her life. On the night the article was published, Samantha stood on the balcony of Alexander's penthouse, the city lights stretching endlessly before her. The cold air nipped at her skin, but she didn't care. She had never felt more alive. She heard the door open behind her, and a moment later, Alexander stepped beside her. "It's over," he said. She let out a soft laugh, shaking her head. "No, it's just beginning." He turned to her, curiosity in his gaze. She took a deep breath. "I want to keep going, keep writing. There are more stories out there, more people like me who were silenced, forgotten. I want to be the voice they never had." A slow smile touched Alexander's lips. "Then do it." Samantha bit her lip. "I don't know where to start." "I do." He reached into his pocket and handed her an envelope. She frowned, opening it. Her breath caught. Inside was an official job offer, a position at one of the most prestigious investigative journalism firms in the country. Her hands trembled. You did this?" "I made a call," Alexander admitted. "But the job is yours because of your talent, not my connections." Samantha looked up at him, overwhelmed. For years, she had believed she was nothing, that she had lost everything. But now, because of this man, this relentless, infuriating, wonderful man, she had been given a second chance, and she wasn't going to waste it. A lump formed in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you." Alexander held her gaze, something unreadable flickering in his expression. Then, in a voice softer than she had ever heard from him, he said, "Just be happy, Samantha." Her heart skipped. For a long moment, they simply stood there. The city below them, the future ahead of them. Maybe this was just the beginning of her career. Maybe it was the beginning of something else, too. Either way, she was finally ready to embrace whatever came next, because she had fought for her life, and she had won.